Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and we're back to the Siamese Cats. And, we're also back to a book where Koko spends a great deal more of the book knocking things over and trying to communicate with Qwilleran, ostensibly. Although I am somewhat amused by Koko knocking a book off a shelf, and when Qwilleran picks it up, he sees that it's The Idiot by Dostoevsky. I suppose it was worth doing. This particular one is The Cat Who Blew the Whistle, and this particular title is actually a little bit more on point than some of these titles. I mean, the titles do always connect with at least part of what's going on, but some of them feel somewhat more tangential than perhaps somewhat more tangential than is perhaps really warranted. In this case, what happens in this book is a very wealthy man who made his fortune, was a blue-collar guy who made his fortune and opened up a credit union. That guy, he winds up purchasing and refurbishing an old steam train and decides he's going to try to run it as, you know, a tourist thing, and because he'd finally get to run trains and the whole 9 yards, and then his bank collapses out from under him and he's under investigation, and then he vanishes. And so Qwilleran winds up looking into the fraud, basically. Except over the course of this book, various people die. Because, in effect, what turns out to have happened in this is that the secretary of this particular Trevelyan, because we all remember Birch Trevelyan, well, this is Floyd Trevelyan, and it turns out that his secretary was actually the one running the fraud, and his secretary murdered him and murdered his son and murdered his son's friend because the secretary had talked them into murdering their father in order to help with covering up the tracks of the fraud. It's a whole thing. And the secretary is actually a cross-dresser. Heaven knows why. But, yes, the secretary is actually a man pretending to be a woman who commits fraud and then frames his former boss. Before anybody brings up any genderqueer issues, I suspect that this, in this particular book, the implication is just that he was dressing up as a woman because once he'd committed the fraud, if everyone only knows him as Nella, they're not going to be looking for Lionel, are they? So this isn't a book that's going to have any progressive genderqueer issues associated with it. It's just a particularly important step in the process of pulling off the fraud. This book also sees the return of a character that I quite liked 2 books back. We read The Cat Who Went Into the Closet, and that's the book in which Qwilleran meets over the phone Celia Robinson, who was a friend of Euphonia Gage's back in the retirement home that Euphonia Gage moved to. Because as we all know, that when you get old, what you do is you move to Florida. Or possibly, if you are a devotee of Marion from Waiting for God, then you move to Antigua. But, you know, we're dealing with North America here rather than the UK, so Florida. So what happens is that, amongst other things, Qwilleran invites Celia Robinson north for reasons of food. Because, I've said it before and I'll say it again, these books are a lot about food. It is a keynote thing in these books, and it will always be a keynote thing in these books because Qwilleran likes food. So, this book actually has a great deal less food in it, except for the kibibbles, which are apparently just really nicely done croutons. But Qwilleran basically invites Celia Robinson up north because A, he wants food, and B, he wants to send her to spy on the rest of the Trevelyan family, one of whom, luckily for Qwilleran, I suppose, is an invalid in a wheelchair, so she gets to have somebody come out there and visit her as sort of, one of those public service volunteer visitor programs for the housebound and invalid who get to have somebody come and visit them. There are programs like that. And so Quill basically invites her for his own nefarious purposes, but it means that she moves up to Pickaxe. Qwilleran's Light of Love Polly is the other major theme in this, is really the other major theme in this book aside from investigating the fraud. In the previous book, she had been to Oregon, and when she came back with plans to build her own house because she'd rented her whole life, and her friend who was an architect said, "Here, let me design plans for you to have a house, and it will be your own house, and it will be made to your own specs for your needs." And she basically starts to stress herself out because Polly is an educated woman and she's a very smart woman, but she is a librarian by trade and training. She is not an architect. She is not a builder. She is not a landscaper. She is not an interior designer. And as time passes, she stresses out more and more and more, worrying herself to death because she wants to do everything herself. And as the book progresses, Qwilleran becomes more and more concerned about her, but also shorter and shorter with her on the topic of, when she says, "Oh, maybe we could turn all of that into a berm. I wonder how to landscape a berm." And he says to her rather sharply that what you do is you contact somebody who went to a landscaping training who knows how to make berms. That's what you do. But she wants to place her own stamp on it. And she becomes more and more concerned and indeed suffers a heart attack at the end of this book. And so this is a book which has just this low-grade level of stress through it. And I think that sets it apart from the others. I mean, they're all different. The other thing that sets this one apart is, for the first time in a long time, Qwilleran doesn't move at the start of the book. He doesn't go anywhere new. He's at home in his converted barn, and he doesn't leave his converted barn. He lives in his converted barn the whole time. The most traveling that he does is at the start of the book when the steam engine and various high expense cars attached to the locomotive go on their maiden and practically only voyage, $500 a ticket, the proceeds going to charity. But I lost my train of thought. This is the problem with not preparing. You wind up thinking that you know what you're going to say, and then you don't, and then you look at the timer and go, "Okay, 9 minutes. Is that enough? Should I give up or not?" But no, the closest Qwilleran gets to traveling is taking that one locomotive trip, and then the locomotive doesn't, and then he doesn't go anywhere else for the rest of the book, and the locomotive gets exactly one more trip at the end, which I probably shouldn't tell you about, but I will anyways, because Qwilleran writes a folk song about it. There is indeed the incomplete set of lyrics of the folk song at the end. I assume that the tune that is supposed to go with it is a real one, but since I don't know the tune, I could not possibly sing it for you. So, at the end of the book, Floyd Trevelyan's father-in-law, who violently hated Floyd, and who had only just had a reunion with his daughter, and had saved up huge amounts of money because, of course, he was an employee of the railroads for a long time, from back in the days when unions actually gave you guaranteed long-term incomes and the whole 9 yards. But he and a bunch of his old pals at the old folks' home decided that they were going to ride the train one last time, and he decides to ride it full speed into a ditch. It is possible to ride a train full speed into a ditch, after all. I mean, we've all heard of train derailments, but, I mean, he deliberately set out to do it because he wanted to, die doing what he loved, not die in an old folks' home. Which is a sentiment a lot of people have. It's not one that I personally understand, but then again, I don't care deeply enough about any given activity to want to die while doing it. And it's an affecting little moment at the end when we discover that he did himself in this way. So, this is a book that's very much less about the murders. The murders get solved incidental to the solving of the mystery of where the millionaire vanished off to. I mean, we later discover that he was murdered, but we don't discover that until the end of the book. Up until nearly the end of the book, we're still pretty sure that what's happened is Floyd Trevelyan has vanished off to either Switzerland or Mexico. And as I said, it isn't really until the end of the book that we discover that he actually did die. Also, they kill a dog, which is very sad and unfortunate because, I mean, seriously, the dog didn't do anything. So, I don't have a lot to say about this one, partly because I had to power through it at the last minute to be sure I remembered what even happened. Qwilleran actually does write some columns in this for a change. Not all of these books have Qwilleran doing columns. It also does that old saw of Qwilleran's of, I'm going to write a book. And then he never does, because Qwilleran doesn't write books, he threatens to write books. And I think that's everything on this particular book, and I will see you guys for the one coming after this in 2 weeks, which will be The Cat Who Said Cheese, if you actually wanted to try to get ahead of things for a change. So this video is going to be a little bit shorter than usual, which is great because I'm really on a time crunch. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you guys next week.